I am Dr. Kiana Brown, and I am thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Katherine Hirchak, this morning. Well, it's morning for her, afternoon for us. Dr. Hirchak is our speaker this afternoon for the Special Population Seminar, and she is an assistant professor at the College of Medicine at the Washington State University, and she's a federally recognized descendant of the Eastern Shoshone tribe. In this seminar, Professor Hirchak will discuss approaches to culturally adapting evidence-based treatments among Indigenous communities with a focus on contingency management and medications for opioid use disorder. For almost 15 years, she has partnered with tribal communities to address health inequities and enhance well-being. Dr. Hirchak's research interests, activities, and training include health policy, assessing alcohol and substance use disorder interventions among American Indian and Alaskan Native communities, conducting clinical trials and mixed methods research in diverse settings, and culturally adapting evidence-based intervention. So Dr. Hirchak will be taking questions at the end of this seminar. Please feel free to place your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them. So Dr. Hirchak, please take it away and welcome to this seminar and welcome to Rutgers.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Brown, and I'm really excited to be here today. So again, I'm really glad to be here, and Zant Sikanve Chu and Zant Sikandave. So good morning, good afternoon. I'm Kait Hirchak, and I will be talking about culturally recentering evidence-based treatments among Indigenous communities. And I always like to start out with the WSU land and territories acknowledgement. So I'm actually calling in from the beautiful traditional territories of the Squaxin, known more commonly as Olympia, Washington. And as other scholars have done, I just want to acknowledge the traditional territories and the ancestors from where you're calling in. I have no conflicts to declare. Another thing that I like to do is start out with a little bit about myself. So I always like to have acknowledgements as well, and this work would not be possible without community and tribal partners, so I always like to acknowledge them, although sometimes some of our data sharing agreements, I'm not able to share the community specifically, but a broad acknowledgement of their support. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Mike McDonald, who's been instrumental in the contingency management work that I've been doing. And then of course, Kelsey Badgett and Mina Richardson, who have helped with the day-to-day, as well as NIDA CTN, Doctors Kamala Venner, Amy Campbell, John Roll. And then I'm also supported on a KO1 through NIAAA. And then these are some photos of my family and ancestors. I am a descendant of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, as Dr. Brown mentioned, and my mom still lives on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, along with my extended family, and my sister is the interim attorney general for the Eastern Shoshone tribe. So I try to get back there as frequently as I can. But I just want to thank everyone again for putting the seminar on, and the leadership team, as well as the New Jersey Act Special Populations. So really excited to be here. And also, my dad is a New York Italian, New Jersey Italian American, so I have that connection too. So I want to start out with significance, as we do frequently, and really pushing back on stereotypes around alcohol use among Native communities. So we can see here from data from 2019, non-Hispanic white communities actually have higher rates of past year alcohol use compared to Native communities. We see that past year opioid use and misuse among Native communities is higher than non-Hispanic white communities. And since this is 2019, we've also been hearing, unfortunately, how fatalities have been much higher, opioid-related fatalities have been much higher among Native communities. But this is variable by state and region, and it tends to be higher for opioid fatalities in Washington, Minnesota, Alaska, and Oklahoma. But the real takeaway here is that even though there can be some similar rates of use or even less among Native communities, they are disproportionately impacted by the negative consequences of substance misuse. And so this is really why it's so important to have effective and engaging, culturally appropriate treatments for Native communities. So I just wanted to highlight that too. So this is a picture of where I'm calling in from. It's not quite as sunny today. The sun's trying to pop out. We had some reports of possible snow. So, but this is where we're living right now. So another sort of discussion around justification for cultural adaptations. When we're thinking about what cultural adaptations mean, Castro and colleagues define this really as systematic modification of evidence-based treatments so that you are really considering and contextualizing language, culture, and the setting, and to make sure that it is compatible with your clients' or participants' cultural patterns, their meaning, their worldview, and their values. And some of the reasons why we do culturally adapt include, if you're applying an intervention to a new community, if there's evidence that there's been poor engagement, if there's unique risk or protective factors to consider, if there's, limited effectiveness, as well as if there's differences in the symptom or the disorders. And we think about cultural adaptation as a way to not only improve outcomes, but also increase acceptability. So there are many ways to go about culturally adapting evidence-based interventions. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just some frameworks and ways that we've gone about culturally adapting some of our projects. There is a lack of consensus around providing or conducting scientifically rigorous approaches to culturally adapting. So there's quite a few ways of going about it, but no real standardized process. So many approaches to consider. So with us, we within Native communities are very much supportive of community-based participatory research. That's really best practice and the gold standard for this work. And there's also an additional nuance with Native communities in terms of tribal sovereignty. So Native people, tribes really have the ability to dictate what they believe will be effective in their communities. And so if they're not wanting the intervention, there might be requirements to adapt it, but really that is up to them, and really CBPR supports that process. So community-based participatory research built on the strengths and resources of the community. It really enhances collaborative partnerships, promotes co-learning, and is a very empowering process that really focuses on power sharing. So that's one approach that we really highly recommend. Some other considerations are around surface versus deep adaptation. So you might be familiar with Dr. Lau's seminal paper around, when we, might do deeper adaptations or when they may be more surface oriented. And when I think of surface adaptations, it's a little bit more about adjusting the materials themselves or the person maybe delivering the intervention. So I tend to think of it a little bit more around branding, whereas deeper adaptations, you're actually changing aspects or components of the intervention while still maintaining those components that are effective, the effective pieces of the intervention, while other pieces might be free to vary. So another framework that we've also recently looked into, my mentor, Dr. Venner, using the ecological validity model, which has 8 dimensions, and she recently had a paper published around this, looking at how it might be used to look at cultural adaptations among Latinx and Hispanic communities. And that's really great in that it focuses on specific domains, so language, persons, metaphors, content, concepts, goals, methods, and context. I have that written down, so I'll have to ping it to you if you want to see that specifically. And then culturally grounded versus culturally adapted. So this goes a little bit back to CBPR. So a community might want to develop a intervention from within, from their own community, based upon their own values, their own worldview. Doing this has been shown to protect against potential iatrogenic effects or inadvertently reinforcing colonization or, structural racism or some other sort of stereotyping that, although maybe is unintentional, can still occur. So those are things to kind of consider when doing this work. And so when we think about cost, it can be really expensive to culturally ground. CBPR work, we don't do this for the publications. So it's really time-consuming work and very relational. And so that's another reason why culturally adapting might be a little bit faster. And kind of looking at this culturally grounded versus culturally adapted approach as part of my KO1 training. So I'm learning how to do more of that around contingency management. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about evidence for culturally adapted SUD interventions. So this is a meta-analysis that was recently published by Hai and colleagues, and they pooled data from 22 studies. And when we are looking at the meta-analysis, we're thinking about the effect size as the magnitude of the difference between the two groups, so that average or mean difference. And many of these interventions were the culturally adapted intervention versus an inactive control. And effect sizes of about 0.2 we usually consider as being small, 0.5 medium, and then 0.8 larger. And so these studies included, this meta-analysis included studies that were done in Africa, Asia, and then the US. And then with the US communities, it was primarily Indigenous and Hispanic Latinx. And so the types of adaptations that they found across these studies were related to language, as we talked about, some of these surface sort of approaches of what they called ethnic matching, so making sure the provider was from the community. And then there was evidence for culturally adapting, although the effect size was smaller. It was about 0.25 for interventions related to alcohol use. And previous meta-analyses by Hall and colleagues have found a medium effect size. And then, as I mentioned, the scoping review that Dr. Venner just published looking at Latinx and Hispanic communities and the cultural adaptations around that found medium to larger effect sizes for the treatment outcomes among the culturally adapted interventions. So now I wanted to turn to my 2 brief case studies here. The first is rewarding recovery, and the second is the Centering Culture and Medications for Opioid Use Disorder with Native Communities. And that is a picture of the Togadi Pass area between my home, Wind River in Wyoming, and going over to Jackson Hole, Yellowstone area. So wanted to share that with you all. So I've been really honored to be a part of the contingency management projects and teams with Dr. Mike McDonnell and John Roll and Sterling McPherson. Dr. McDonnell has led both a single site intervention study of contingency management as well as a multi-site study with many Native communities. I think we have maybe like over 500 participants, Native participants across the two studies. And there are very few RCTs among Native communities. So we're really very proud of the fact that Native communities are the ones demonstrating the evidence of effective health approaches for their communities and rural communities and non-Native communities. So contingency management, for those of you that may not be as familiar with it, is where you provide tangible reinforcers for providing demonstrated abstinence from a priority behavior. So in our case, alcohol abstinence and drug abstinence. And the steps of contingency management include monitoring that behavior, and then when that priority behavior occurs, so when there's abstinence from drug or alcohol, then you provide an incentive, a prize, a reward. And then with our approach, the longer period of abstinence equals the larger the reward. And if the priority behavior doesn't occur, you just don't provide the incentive, but you remain very positive, very strength-based and encouraging. And contingency management is the most effective non-pharmacological treatment for initiating abstinence, especially among stimulant use disorder, which there are no medications for. And so it's really great because it teaches new behaviors. It's very relational. It promotes a positive atmosphere. It enhances accountability of the patient client and just really helps to jumpstart abstinence. So the rewarding recovery study, the overall goal was to see if CM led to reductions in alcohol and drug use among a single rural reservation community. And so the two steps were culturally adapting to maximize acceptability, and then the 12-week RCT. So to be eligible, 18 years or older, self-identifying as Native, DSM diagnosis from the DSM-4 of alcohol dependence, using an illegal drug or opioid in the last month. As I mentioned, the treatment phase was 12 weeks long, and folks came in 3 times a week, provided a urine sample, and then if they were abstinent, they received their rewards. And this is a complicated study for me. I'm going to do my best to describe it, but I'm always like, okay, we're not, please, Dr. McDonnell, let's not do another study like this. But we're comparing 3 different versions. So we have our control group where they receive prizes for attendance, essentially. And then I will explain the other arms of the study here in a second. But the primary outcome was attendance, and then looking at alcohol use and drug use, which was assessed by UDTs, and then the alcohol use was assessed through ethyl glucuronide and or ETG biomarker, which is a metabolite of alcohol created in the liver, and then we're able to assess it through urine tests. And you can assess alcohol use for 2 to 5 days, depending on the amount of that drinking episode. So here are the steps of some of the cultural adaptations that were made to rewarding recovery before and while we were implementing it. And so starting out with concepts of recovery. So here, this figure, we see a medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel is very culturally meaningful. in many tribal communities, in the Northern Plains, in the Great Plains region, in my community specifically as well. But it's not necessarily culturally meaningful for other tribal communities. So in the Northwest, we may have identified another, metaphor that we could use. But for this community, the medicine will fit. And for us, what this represents is finding the harmony and balance in our lives. So emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, really integrating those 4 directions, 4 seasons. And so we adapted this figure to kind of highlight each study visit. So as I said, for this study, folks came in 3 times a week. And these visits last no more than 10 to 15 minutes. So they're really short. And so the person comes in, you greet them, very conversational, very strength-based interaction, just really building those relationships. Then we move down to measure in the South, which is really about, destigmatizing urine analysis and just using it as a tool for conversation. So we have, if the outcome is expected, then we can move on to reinforce. But if it was an unexpected outcome, we stay very encouraging. What resources do you need? You've done it before, you can do it again, those types of discussions. But if it was an expected outcome, then we move to reinforce. And this is when the party happens. People are really excited. They get their incentives, their rewards, and that can be really a fun thing to be a part of. And then we move to, regardless, we move to record the outcome. And this is where we highlight the UA result and whether an incentive was provided, and we provide details around that, which is really important nowadays with contingency management, thankfully, becoming more popular. Previously, it was there were some challenges around delivering it with fraud and Medicaid issues. So now we're just training the model that is much more compliant and aligns with the safe harbor laws now that have been updated by the Biden administration. So it's really important to record the outcome and why the incentive was provided to the participant as part of their treatment plan. And then at the center, tying it all together, is gratitude. So gratitude to the participant, the client, for their journey, and just being a support to them. So then in terms of prizes, we were able to adapt some of those. So what we were hearing in our focus groups was how important family is. So something that could be shared with their family, some gift card that could be used to purchase gifts or other needs of the family. This was pre-COVID, so having dinners out, to nice restaurant or going to the movies or something like that was emphasized as being really important. We are also able to integrate speaking in your native language. So we were lucky to have elders deliver the intervention in one community. And so they were able to speak their native language and really provide that as an opportunity to revitalize that with the client. People have varying levels of comfort around their cultural connection. And so this created a nice space for that to occur. The staff can really be anyone. So it doesn't have to be a clinician, a highly, trained clinician with a lot of degrees. The person providing the intervention can be peer support. They can be, as I mentioned, an elder, which was wonderful. The person just needs to really be positive, non-judgmental, and just have an empathetic approach to treatment. And then the other sort of adaptation that was really important was around recognition and honoring the individuals. So having positive affirmations, graduation certificates. Some communities have cultural dinners or feasts that are really a great way to recognize. So in the current work that we're doing, training Native communities who are interested in implementing a contingency management program, we provide some of the things that we did and some of the approaches that we took, but it really is something that can be adapted to each community. So we support folks in doing that. Okay, so now for the complicated arms of this study. So the first was the alcohol only. So folks randomized to this group only received incentives when they were abstinent from alcohol. The second group only received incentives when they were abstinent from drugs. Then the really mean group was the group where they only received incentives for when they were abstinent from drugs and alcohol. And then we had our control group where they received incentives just for attending study visits. So we had 120 people, about half were female, about 36 years old, half with a high school diploma or higher. And then here we have some of the baseline participant substance use. So within this community, specifically methamphetamine use was the most used substance. So this outcome is looking at attendance, and we can see a bunch of squiggly lines for all of the intervention groups, but the one that I'll highlight is the top one with the X's, and then the bottom one with more of the diamonds. So obviously those that just were receiving incentives for attending, surprising, they were the ones that attended more. And then the folks that were only, or that were getting reinforced for both drugs and alcohol attended the least amount of visits, which makes sense across the 12-week period. So a total of 24 visits here. And then for alcohol, we see that it was great to see that all three groups reduced their alcohol use compared with the control group. And then only the CM for other drugs and CM for alcohol had lower drug use. So what we found was that people liked contingency management. It aligned with community values. There were many opportunities to engage with culture. We were happy to see that there was attendance was, better for those that were being reinforced for attending. And that it was effective for alcohol and drug use, and especially for stimulant use. It was much higher effect sizes. So we're really happy to be able to, we've worked really hard on some training materials, so we're in the process of disseminating these now, and I will hopefully have time to talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Because I really wanted to talk about centering culture and medications for opioid use disorder communities and in Native communities. And this is a clinical trials network study that is being led by Drs. Kamala Venner and Amy Campbell. And the background for this study, it's an implementation study, and actually Dr. Brown also helped workshop this for our career development program that we're in, the NIDA LEAD program with the PIs, Drs. Carmen Masson and Jim Sorensen. So it was really great to have extra set of eyes on that. But basically the background of the study is that it's an implementation study to be delivered in 4 Native organizations or communities in both urban and rural areas. And it's using components of CBPR to best figure out how we can culturally center and implement medications for opioid use disorders. So we're identifying the key components that will facilitate that. We are introducing and tailoring implementation strategies, both from a Western and Indigenous sort of framework. And then we are building partnerships for bidirectional learning to really achieve the aims of the study. And methods of the paper was focused on describing the two-day event. It was a kickoff of our National Collaborative Board. And during the first few months of the study, the PIs had folks that were nominated, volunteered to join the collaborative board. And so we had about 26 folks attend, and we had physicians, prescribers, we had behavioral health, we had Native and non-Native researchers. It was really exciting to have a Native ethnobotanist. We had some NIDA CTN representatives and D&I experts. So it was a really great group of people that came together to discuss some of these considerations around culturally centering MOUD. So it occurred in October 2019, so right before the pandemic, we were able to come together. So the paper focuses on the discussion process that we had around some questions, and we adapted the World Cafe to the Res Cafe, because of course we're adapting everything. So this is essentially a qualitative facilitation method where you have tables set up and people are at tables discussing different questions. And then you move to another table to discuss additional questions. And so for us, we had about 4 or 5 people at each table, and they had about 15 minutes to discuss. And then at each table were flip chart paper so that we could capture the conversation. In mind maps is where you put the discussion question or concept in the center and then branch out from the center with the brainstorming that occurs. It's also really great because you can capture drawings, symbols, so it can be a really creative way to have a discussion. It doesn't just have to be about words. And so our questions really focused on what causes OUD in Native communities, how can we present traditional ideas of holistic health, how can we integrate traditional healing practices into these diverse settings, and I have a list of questions I can share if that's of interest. We had 3 coders, and we had an iterative process where the collaborative board provided feedback on interpretation of results. So the 3 overarching themes that were identified related to the complex causes of opioid use disorder, Native cultural strengths, and integration of healing traditions, practices, and the holistic approaches to wellness in MOUD, and then similarities and differences across the treatment perspectives. So here's the first mind map. And we can see at the center, this was a discussion around strengths, and the primary themes from that were around family, healing, networks, spirituality, hope, and acceptance. And so from there, for family, for an example, we can see that people were talking about clans and kinship, how compassion is really important. Healing, we can see traditional healing practices that were highlighted, that we should include sweat lodge, or host different cultural activities around crafting or other things like that. really within the networks, identifying that social support, whether it be the tribe or the family, but being able to pass along that knowledge and just really support cultural survival. Then with spirituality, it was really about ceremony and teachings and how the elders can help with that. And then, of course, with hope and acceptance, Native humor is always so important. So really emphasizing that as a part of the intervention. So we're in the process of integrating these concepts into the final intervention, which we have our 4 sites identified now. So that's been really an exciting process as well. So then this mind map is brainstorming how you center wellness in MOUD. And one of the things that we wanted to highlight here was the holistic wellness. So when we centered that, it looks different from when we were centering MAT. And at that point, we were calling it MAT. So you can see that there's less inspiration when we're focusing the MAT. So really, again, highlighting the importance of culture and wellness to Native communities. And so here we see spiritual teachings and elders as the primary themes. So again, just really highlighting the cultural values. This was also really focusing on, yes, the medications are super important, but also the holistic approach around food being medicine, traditional teas and herbs being super important to address other symptoms, as well as some of the symptoms the folks might have directly related to opioids. And then just really thinking about the importance, again, of elders and family in this. So whether that be repairing family relationships or strengthening them, that was something that was thought to be very important. And so with this map, we had about 28 themes and sub-themes. And then with our mat at the center, we had about 17 themes and sub-themes. And so this really focused on education, culture, and spirituality. So we really have identified that implementation should be strength-based and really focus on holistic well-being and the importance of engagement and recovery strategies that include family, and then consistently with other communities as well, addressing stigma and building trust between providers, prescribers, and clients. Really figuring out how we can integrate healing practices, ceremonies, and other cultural activities into MOUD, and then just really centering Native culture and family in this work. So the MOUD study is an implementation study, and I think that that's a super important piece to culturally adapting EBTs among Native communities. So I was hoping I had some time to quickly highlight it. Maybe I can do this in like 2 minutes. But we have recently published a few articles around this. D&I science is just really growing in Native communities. There's not a lot out there quite yet, especially since there's not a lot of evidence-based interventions that have been implemented with Native communities. And so doctors Lorinda Ballone and Nina Wallerstein out of the University of New Mexico, really helped move this forward, as well as I mentioned, Amy Campbell out of Columbia. So really thinking about how D&I should focus on research that addresses the implementation and practice gap, and how best to address that through culturally appropriate interventions. Again, community-based participatory research is really important in these efforts. Really identifying community need and context. Communities know what they want and need, so ensuring that you focus on that. And recent efforts have really focused on scaling up of interventions and building capacity to conduct research. So tribal members being able to develop their own research questions and their own research infrastructure is something that's very needed, and what communities really want. Also thinking about letting culture sort of guide the research and sustainability around the implementation, I think gets lost in some of these approaches. So really making sure that we continue to bring that to the fore. And then thinking about implementation strategies or frameworks or theories right from the jump is really important, because we tend to do that, and we're guilty of this too. We tend to do that sort of in a retrospective manner, and it can really help with sustainability and longevity when we think about it at the beginning. Escoffrey and colleagues noted that I think it's about less than half of the studies that they've reviewed had identified an implementation framework to even guide their work or research. So again, just really doing that intentionally at the beginning. And I think more so than in other communities, Native communities need effectiveness in D&I studies to impact health outcomes due to sovereignty. And so really thinking through the multi-level systems and policies and all of that, so D&I strategies can really assist. And then also funders recognizing the importance of this work and having hybrid studies that can really build up the literature. So I wanted to end with emphasizing strengths of our Native communities, because we really have so many. And I really love this quote from the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board around efforts to address opioid use disorder. And also want to end just talking about how, some tribal communities have decided that Western and cultural approaches to health and healing in recovery are really needed. And while Western-based approaches, folks have found that they are effective for them, they can be, steeped in racism or structural racism, and may continue to inadvertently reinforce those things. So being really cognizant of the importance of integrating culture and spirituality into recovery is just very important. So thank you again, Dr. Brown, Georgette, and the leadership team of the New Jersey ACTS for having me present today. And I can answer questions or however you all want to move forward. But thank you again. It's really great chatting with you all.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Kait. And then I guess everybody can turn on their cameras so we can see each other, which I think is always so much nicer too. And so I guess we open up the floor. Anyone have any, Jamie, you have a question?
Oh no, I was doing the clap, but I may have a question, but I'll see if anybody else wants to jump in first, if Kiana has anything kind of facilitating wise.
I always have questions. I don't have a question. I do have a comment. It's just thinking broadly about substance use disorders. And Dr. Hirchak, again, your wonderful presentation. It's like we've forgotten this. Like have forgotten how to heal. Right? Treatment can be traumatizing, right? It seems like what you're presenting should be how treatment in general works for humans. Like, I don't know what we're doing in the lab with the rats and stuff, but in the fight, the struggle that you mentioned, funding and, recognizing that this is important. Just as a researcher, as a practitioner, how is this not the standard? Why do we have to beg? Please give me funding. Please be a decent practitioner and don't traumatize people who need treatment. How did we get so far from healing?
Yeah, I think that's a really important comment, and it is, like you said, it goes across community because it unfortunately can be a part of treatment approach and recovery strategies, working towards destigmatizing the language and, different approaches still are stigmatized, like medications. Communities may be resistant to that if they have more of, an AA philosophy. So yeah, we've really just found that it is about education and, like you said, healing, and also identifying some of the root causes, right? So, really being very mindful that, what we're healing from, which is essentially colonization, right? And how we go about that in a way that is revitalizing, and not always, based in deficits. So, a lot of what we're doing also has those pieces that, have sort of that history, like, urine drug screening and all of that kind of stuff. But we've really been able to reframe some of it in a way that does feel like a conversation, something, that you can almost celebrate, something that's about accountability and not something that, is negative. So yeah, I think we're got a lot of work to do, but it is exciting to be moving in that direction.
Thanks. So Peter had a question too.
Yeah. Thank you, Kait. That was an awesome presentation. Really appreciate you coming and speaking for us today. I had a question, like if you were trying to develop an intervention, I guess I'm kind of thinking of it here in New Jersey, where we don't have like a large Native population, but a diverse population where you have people from all different cultural backgrounds. Like what's the best way for contingency management to make it so it's like to make that intervention so it's kind of like taking account for that when you have like people from diverse cultures, but you also want to somehow tailor it, or is the best approach in that situation to just use something that's equal, I guess, across for everyone, like a cash payment or something like that?
Yeah, so there are more Native people in New Jersey and New York than I was even aware of. I just recently saw, I was like, wow, there is a Native community there, more so than I was expecting. But yeah, in terms of diversity of communities, I think again, what makes contingency management so nice is that you really have to make sure the reinforcer is reinforcing to that individual. So, you really can develop that with the person themselves. So, we train people to go through despite having a bunch of like awesome incentives and rewards and all of that, what tends to continue to be the most popular are gift cards. Because it really does. One of the cultural things about that kept getting highlighted to us was that it really is about personal choice. So gift cards can do that through different like online marketplaces like Tango. So we found that even just, people have a lot of fun just sitting down and looking on the computer and identifying which gift cards they could use through Tango. So that's one way, again, making sure that the person delivering the intervention, has a connection to the community that they're interacting with. So a great way to do that is, to be in, outpatient community treatment settings, where you're likely to have, better sort of feel for that. So those are some of the bigger picture strategies that we've been sort of training around, but certainly, yes, gift cards and having those direct sort of payments or incentives are definitely very popular.
Thank you. Yeah, and your talk made me think about like it's ideal, I think, if I understood correctly, to try to develop these incentives in a way that they like promote other aspects of recovery too.
Yes.
Like, what you were talking about with building stronger connections to family and the community and culture sounded really important, and it gives me some ideas for adapting them in other ways.
Yay, awesome. I'm glad that there was some relevance to what you're doing.
And Masika, I think you had.
Hey.
Great. Hey.
How's it going?
Good. I'm sorry I was late, but so happy to be able to catch the tail end. And some of the things that you were saying, really educated me in some of the similarities that are being faced across the country, right, as we try and think about what does it mean to really eliminate disparities and engagement in recovery and in all of its shapes and forms. And so one of the things that I was very surprised at the emphasis that the CTN has in engaging with Native communities. I was really surprised and very pleased to hear about that, because that's not something that I hear very much about, or even in thinking about some of the other kind of clinical trials networks on like the HIV side, that there's not necessarily kind of that similar approach. And so was really just pleased to hear about that and curious about what from kind of like a funding, kind of a more NIH funding type of mechanism, if you could give a little bit of background, or if you know about some of that development, because I think that as we continue to think about communities that have the greatest need and what does it mean to, address the prior abuses around research, what are some of the things that are being done from the funding perspective to help support the work that you're doing besides giving you money. So I just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that the CTN has been, doing a lot of great work around being more intentional around the communities that they recruit into interventions and how to, adapt those. They have a great special, I think it's a special interest group focused on a bunch of these different, challenges and strength-based approaches to take through the CTN. So there's a minority one, there is a Native SIG. So, and those are open to everybody. So I would encourage, folks that are interested in CTN, funding to definitely join those because they're doing a lot of great work. The CTN is its own sort of animal. I don't know how familiar you are with it in terms of how it's funding. So you essentially submit a protocol to a node. And so the nodes that I've been most connected with are the Southwest node and the Pacific Northwest node. And then there's I believe it's the New York node. So I know that those areas are really interested in this work and continuing to fund, implementation and dissemination activities around that. But beyond that, I'm not too sure, but I think that it's a great jumping off point, and I encourage people to get involved in those different groups too if they have an interest. But thank you so much for the question, and I really appreciate everyone's questions. I also just put in the chat some of our videos, so especially the digital success story. Those are so much more moving than anything that I could ever describe. So I really encourage, if you have an extra 5 minutes or so, to check those out too.
Dr. Hirchak, I want to thank you again for coming to Rutgers, for presenting at this NJ Ag Special Populations course seminar, and your research and your presentation was absolutely inspiring. And we thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, again, everyone, New Jersey Ags and Georgette, for putting this on. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for the questions too.